Buenas, Jan saludos, Jan tirawami to all promotees and especially to the graduating class of 2021. I am Dr. Alfred Ada and I am your Commissioner of Education. I'm so proud of each of you. Today, you have achieved a major goal in your life that will forever be an example of how resilient and strong you are. You have arrived at this day, this very special moment of success, of leveling up. But I know that your journey to get here has not been easy. You have been through super typhoons, financial hardships, and a global pandemic. You've known the harsh reality of living without power and water, or worrying about the roof over your head and food for your loved ones. And most recently, you've experienced the hardship of adjusting to a completely different way of learning and living. Some say that you have made it through the impossible. Some might describe your achievement today as a miracle. But I am not surprised at all. Anyone who knows anything about the people of Marianas, the Marianas people are the ancestry of perseverance, ingenuity, strength, and community that makes us unbreakable. Our story has never been just about surviving. It's one of thriving. Like the coconut trees, itrong kunizuk, we bend down and sway in the storm, but our roots remain tough, firmly planted and secure, and our fruit remains a powerful reminder of the life within us. You belong to a generation that has experienced so much. Maybe some of you who are listening to me today feel like your milestone is not as memorable because of all the trauma you have endured. If that's the case, know that you have every right to feel that way. Your feelings are valid. But I need you to not let those feelings stay with you. Let them land, but don't let them stay. Take control and remember, you are the class who took the past year's impossibility and owned it and making the impossible possible. When all the signs around you told you that you could not fly, you defied gravity and soared higher than anyone could expect. Your achievement today is historic and no one will ever forget it or take it from you. I have devoted my life to education, so in true educator fashion, let me send you off on the next phase of your journey with some advice. In Chamorro, we don't just say hello and goodbye. We have a custom called saludo dan despedida. Isaludo means to say hello, but with a deep, genuine appreciation for the person you are greeting. Saludo means to share the island spirit, the smile, the life, and the light. Go into the next phase of your journey and connect with people. Spread that islander light, pride, and respect that is ingrained within each of you, and be banidosu, or proud. Just as important as saying hello is, saying goodbye is equally as important. Practice the custom of despedida, or saying farewell, adios. It is not just a simple goodbye. It means adios with a deep sense of appreciation for the person you are leaving. It's about leaving a lasting impression of deep gratitude for the person you are saying goodbye to. My despedida to you is a final call to action, to go forth with the spirit of inafamolik, which means to make good. This is my challenge to you. Go out and do good. Lift up the people around you. Solve problems and present solutions that make our community, our islas better. Go out with the mission to make the Marianas and our world a better place. Congratulations and biba to all promotees and biba to all graduating class of 2021. Thank you, si Jus Maosi Jan Giliso.
Afade, Gentiro. I am Andrew Orsini, your chairman of the CNMI State Board of Education, and on behalf of my colleagues, I am honored to speak to you. Let me begin by saying congratulations, graduating class of 2021. We all make mistakes. I know that I have. In my life, I've made hundreds, no, millions of mistakes. But hey, I'm in this video, so I guess it wasn't so bad. Have I learned from all my mistakes? Probably not. But all of my mistakes helped shape the person I am today. They've helped me to grow and mature. Now that you're graduating high school, I hope you have new adventures and I hope you make new mistakes along the way. More importantly, I hope you learn from them. As you can see, mistakes are meant to teach us right from wrong and more importantly, who we are. As you go through this new adventure in your lives, you will all make mistakes. You might miss deadlines and be late. You might spend money on your girlfriend instead of paying off your loans. You might believe your brother when he says he will pay you back. Honestly, you might end up eating soba every day, who knows? But all these things will make you grow and change. Your mistakes will become just as important as your success. Together, they will define you. One good thing about life is that no one is gonna grade you except maybe the good Lord above. So don't aim to be perfect. Be okay with imperfection, but learn, grow, and get better. That's what life is all about. Thank you, parents and teachers, for letting us all make mistakes. Thank you for shaping us into the imperfect human beings we are today. And most of all, thank you for allowing us to learn from our mistakes as we move forward. Congratulations, class of 2021.
Congratulations to the class of 2021 of Marianas High School. You've made it through it all, the trials and tribulations of high school, a super typhoon, and a pandemic. But finally, you have attained your high school diploma. This school year has seemingly been the year of impossibilities. When schools were closed in March 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it seemed impossible to reopen schools this year. However, we made it happen with the launch of remote learning. Admittedly, remote learning was not an easy experience for everyone by making this massive shift to virtual classes. While it seemed impossible for face-to-face classes to open later on in the first semester, MHS did its best to apply all of the safety precautions to make the reopening of our classrooms happen. It was in cohorts and it was a very different experience, but learning in the classroom was made possible. Sure, not everything was the same or normal as compared to what you have come to expect in high school, but this pandemic has never been experienced before. Whenever you cast doubt in yourself, look at your high school diploma. Remember that earning your diploma is a culmination of your work in all of your classes through your years in high school. Indeed, there were times when you had to work harder than usual, and there might have been times when you felt like giving up. However, remember that you chose to push forward. It is this choice to work hard and persevere that leads you to achieve your goals, no matter how big or small. In the words of Napoleon Hill, if you cannot do great things, do small things in a great way. Congratulations again, class of 2021, on your graduation from high school.
Hapadees and Thru, and welcome to Marianas High School's 2021 commencement ceremony. We are coming to you live from the Saipan Airport Field. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and congratulations to the class of 2020 and enjoy the show. 2021!
All right, graduates. I am John Durag.
And I am Kelly Demapon.
I will be your master
And mistress
of ceremony.
Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the people here on stage to celebrate the MHS Class of 2021. Woo. Governor of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Ralph De Leon Guerrero Torres.
Chairman of the CNMI State Board of Education, Mr. Andrew Orsini.
Vice Chair of the CNMI State Board of Education, Staff Sergeant Herman Atalig.
Secretary and Treasurer of the CNMI State Board of Education, Ms. Macy Tenorio.
Member of the Board of Education, Gregory Borja. Member of the Board of Education, Antonio Borja.
Commissioner of Education, Dr. Alfred Ada.
Associate Commissioner of Education, Eric Magofnia. And PSS Key Management.
Principal and our birthday principal of Marianas High School, Mr. Jonathan Ogden.
Vice Principal of Marianas High School, Ms. Melanie Erdial.
Vice Principal of Marianas High School, Mr. Romulo Orsini.
Thank you to our esteemed dignitaries for joining us. And of course, thank you to those tuning in online.
Hey. Miss Kelly, are you ready?
Yes!
Let's begin with Marianas High School's Class of 2021 Commencement Ceremony. First up, we have Martha Julian S. Cabrera.
Next, we have Morgan Admison Roberts.
Next up, we have Ralph John D. Noceda.
Next up, we have John Owen Guam.
Next, we have Princess Hannah Batalone.
Next up, we have Abigail Jermaine K. Villagomez.
Next up, we have David Kim.
Next up, we have Won Ching Yu.
Next up, we have Mark Payo.
And next up, we have Donna Vergara.
Next up, we have Matthew Alare Candave.
Woo. Next up, we have Kira Rain Borja Flores.
Next up, we have Alan Matutino.
Next up, we have Jedediah Patero.
All right, next we have Kalia Yamada Sablon.
Next up, we have Manuel Borja II.
Next up, we have Ejai Kabiko Metron.
Next up, we have Zandra Nicole Villamena.
Next up, we have Marnica Delfina Villagomez Seguita.
Next up, we have Michaela Vergara.
Next up, we have Ricalyn Lagunero.
have Precious, Zai, and Fielded.
Next up, we have Liana Wanya.
Next up, we have Ryan King.
Next up, we have Joanna Marie Manguera.
Next up, we have Sean Cabiles.
Next up, we have Chase Tenorio.
And next up, we have Angelo Viernes. Woo!
All right, next up, we have Reginald Pasqua.
Next up, we have Jennifer Crolla.
All right. Next up, we have William De Leon Guerrero Salas Jr.
Next up, we have Pollyanna Teriyama.
All right. Next up, we have Francis Borinaga. Congratulations, yes.
Next up, we have Charlene Darlene Olivos.
Congratulations. Let's keep the ball rolling with Manuel John Castro Blas.
Okay, next up, we have Jose Lorenzo P. Reyes.
All right, let's continue with Marian Camille Buencamino Saavedra.
Woohoo! Next up, we have Mariel K. B. Espiritu.
Next up, we have Renz Lester M. Satur.
Next up, we have Francis Isaiah B. Bandagale.
Next up, we have Marv Joseph Mateo.
Next up, Jokas Mangopas Barrera.
Next up, we have Davidin Capileo.
Next up, we have Garrick Rayner C. Santos.
All right. Next up, we have Nefian S. Sablon.
And next up, we have Simon Carl Susie Flores.
All right. Next, we have Carl Leonard L. Edkiba.
Next up, we have Herman C. Tudela III.
All right. Next up, we have Melia Carlene E. Fleming.
Next up, we have Lester Jr. El Cedillo.
Next up, we have Ariana Capileo.
Next up, we have Stephanie Tan Flores.
All right. Next, we have Tristan M. Langdon.
Next up, we have Trisha Zeruya Dinicio Salcedo.
All right. Next up, we have Sydney Camille King Hines.
Next up, we have Alan Arthur Dorotina.
Next up, we have Gabrielle Jean Aldon Mario.
Next up, we have Jandre Dominique Francisco Naraha.
Next up, we have Raylin Singer.
Next up, we have Raphael Russell B. Gando.
All right, next we have Roger Sumpai Jr.
Next up, we have Daisy and Pineda.
All right. Next we have Janalim Burnaby.
All right. Next up, we have Elijah Carmono Villarmero.
All right. Next we have Luisa Marie Benaventi.
Woo! Next up, we have Moses Ferheran de la Vellano.
Next up, we have Maria Jamie Navarro.
And next up, we have Marlouis and Jetta.
All right, next up, we have Jonathan W. Mirafel. All right, next up, we have Timothy James S. Acosta.
And next up, we have Jody Rose I. Lazaro.
Next up, we have Angie Tuala.
Next up, we have Brian Janine A. Orenstia.
Woohoo! Next up, we have Albert Jazel C. Alcaraz.
Next up, we have Rachel Joy Velasquez.
Congratulations. Next up, we have John Timothy Velasquez Vergara.
Next up, we have Capina Mariflor Sanchez Tababa.
All right, next up, we have Ignacio Perez.
All right, congratulations. Next up, we have Ivan Angelo E. Sechon.
All right, next up, we have Javier Perico. All right.
Next up, we have Wendy Liu.
All right, let's keep the ball rolling with Elijah Lezama.
Coming up next is David Su.
All right. Next up, we have Mia Noriko Tenorio Hirsch.
Woo! Coming up, we have Miku Nasho C. Torres.
All right. Next up, we have Derek So.
Next up, we have Clayton Sasamoto.
All right. Let's continue with Alec Jen Regis.
Next up, we have Micah Christina T. Lariosa.
All right, next up we have Greta Lely Tulmar.
Next up, we have Alvin Kwong.
All right, next we have Francis Valete.
Next up, we have Janara Eve Seven Bay.
Next up we have Dominic Torres. Congratulations, Christina.
Next up, we have Juan Guerrero.
All right, next we have Mateo Guerrero.
Next up, we have Bonnie Gio M. Sagana.
All right, next up we have Connie Blas Mendiola.
Next up, we have Alexiana Taekwondo.
All right, next up we have McCray Estrada Miranda.
Next up, we have Francisco Mizutani.
All right, next up we have Andre McCoy C. Metron.
Next up, we have Millard Andy Guzman.
All right, next up we have Michaela Angela P. Delay.
Next up, we have Trina, Grace, Meta, Teneketu. Next up, we have Josh, David, Ray, Jason.
All right, next we have Napupua. Next up, we have Melanie Z. Dasco.
Next up, we have Liana Kitagua de la Cruz.
All right, next up, we have Winev Julian and Chavez.
Next up, we have Kalena de la Cruz Flores.
All right, next up, we have Johnson Lee.
Next up, we have Alexandra Ruben D. Amaro.
All right, next up, we have Brian Bernardo.
Next up, we have April Lisua.
All right, next up, we have Princess Joy B. Galzote.
Next up, we have Stella Yumin On.
right, next up we have Cheyenne Yangrafil.
Hey, next up, we have Tina Chisa Ife Kobayashi.
All right, next up we have Aldrin Angelo P. Galang.
And next up, we have Jelena Anorin de la Cruz Santos.
All right, next up we have Derek Jr. Aegis. All right.
Next up, we have Trixia Gabrielle Arletulamo.
Next up, we have John Hong.
Next up, we have Joshua Alfred.
All right, next we have Grace Reyes.
Yay! Next up, we have Amy Rainu Solomon.
All right, next up we have Kate Bay.
Coming up, we have Ben Jr. Espitable. Hey, hey, hey.
All right, let's work it. Next we have Karen Diaz.
Yes, and next up, we have Arson Mentor.
All right, next up we have Emery Jr. K. Fithiel.
have Creomi Jane A. Capileo.
All right, next out, we have Jackie Gong.
And next up, we have Janine Ariane El Kilanta. Woo!
All right, next up, we have Milagro Omar Palacios.
And next up, we have Adrian Ocampo.
All right, next up, we have Megan Jace A. Arbilo.
Wait, this one, we ready to set this one. We ready to set this one. And next up, we have Bryant Bryce R. Kayabyab.
All right, next up, we have Michaela Haba.
And next up, we have Jonathan B. Mindanao.
All right, next up, we have John Martin F. Pollard.
Next up, we have Sichiro Lango.
All right, next up, we have Mark Daniel Macario Regino.
Next up, we have Milbert Barcelo.
All right, next up, we have Vincent Santos Jr.
Next up, we have Daphne Idlisan Cruzat.
All right, let's keep the ball rolling with Diane Kelly Bautista. Gonza.
Next up, we have Vianney Marie Castro Mesa.
All right, next up we have Richard C. R. Salas.
Next up, we have Ana Maria Ithamar.
All right, next we have Rian Jewel Kadak.
Right. Next up, we have Sheikh Shatash Islam.
Okay, Argonza. Argonza, right? No, no, this one. All right, next up we have Zyrene May Argonza Apostol.
Next up, we have Isaac J. Pangilinan Balbin.
All right. Woo. All right, next up, we have Daniel Jong.
That's Daniel. Next up, we have Cassandra Kendan Biscocho.
All right, next up, we have Maria Camille V. Eustachio.
Next up, we have Merced Regis.
Next up, we have Henin Zaya P. Pamintu. Saipan.
Next up, we have Alele Perez Gamelo.
All right, next up we have Joey Daniel Taktaka Noble.
All right. Next up, we have Olivia Rungro.
All right, next up we have John Ezekiel D. Canape.
Next up, we have Casey Ken D. Martin.
All right, next up we have Madeline Rose Mendiola Flores.
Next up, we have Javelin July Narciso.
All right, next up we have Janelle Ann Ramos Mendoza.
And next up, we have James Camuel Chang.
All right, next up we have Ina Magnaye.
Next up, we have Dan Robles.
All right, next up we have Micaela Fityo. All right, next up we have Jeremiah Clarkson.
Next up, we have Susan Min Mai.
All right, next up we have Dae-Hun Kim.
Next up, we have Marvin M. Obando.
Next up, we have Rinto Takahashi.
Next up, we have Jesse Ray O'Metao.
Next up, we have Nelson J.A. Batalone.
Next up, we have Zarlene Dumagit.
All right, next up, we have Romeli J.E. Hechanova.
Next up, we have Lance Delatore.
Next up, we have Ethan Somol.
Next up, we have Matthew David Carlos.
All right. Next up, we have Jorian Guardian.
Woohoo! All right, next up, we have Lee Lumbana.
Next up, we have David Joaquin Camacho Quirigua.
Next up, we have Yishuan Lee.
Next up, we have Kakani Shaparian.
Next up, we have Diana Mendoza Asunto.
Here, hola. All right, next up we have Renz Gillier Ola Fani.
All right, coming up next, we have Matthew Jeb Corpus.
All right, next up we have Lance Jacob Asistores.
Next up, we have John Glenn B. Constantino.
All right, next up we have Jason Lee.
Next up, we have Matthew G. Tawagon.
All right, next up we have John Andre Loyola Biking.
Next up, we have Christopher Azuzu.
All right, next up we have Anto Rabago.
Next up, we have Cyril J. Achas.
All right, next up we have Jessica Chen.
Next up, we have Vincent Bacani.
Kane is in the building.
Next up we have Nilo Kalibak.
up, we have Maxima Uzoa.
All right, next up we have Carl Justin Arpadiernos.
Next up, we have Zanjo C. Mamawag Jr.
All right, next up we have Janine Feolino.
Next up, we have Daryl M. Morales.
All right, next up we have James Borja Salalila.
Next up, we have Amy E. Cabrera.
All right, next up we have Camille Loste.
Next up to the stage, we have Kina J. Palacios.
All right, next up we have Mark Christopher M. Capileo.
All right, next up, we have Lucia Fermina B. Taimanyao.
All right, next up we have Florencio Richards Jr.
All right, next up, we have Alexandra May de Jesus.
All right, next up we have Bea Patricia Cruz.
Next up, we have John Michael Navarro.
All right. Wait. Next up, we have Stephen Janlin Chen.
Next up, we have Torquato R. Castro.
All right, next up, we have Josephine Balbin.
Next up, we have Maria Isabel Caspa Lopez.
All right, next up, we have Precious Bea Maybe Epan.
All right, next up, we have Vinale M. Hapte.
All right, next up, we have Verily M. Hapday. Yeah.
Next up, we have Francisco M. Hapte.
All right, next up, we have Lenosuke Suzuki.
Next up, we have Maxine Alexandra Q. Rabago.
All right, next up, we have Stephlin V. Tommy.
Next up, we have Thomas Santos.
Next up, we have Kenneth Jake Kaipan.
Next up, we have Crystal Jasmine Pascual.
All right, next up we have Brianna Rose T. Royale.
And next up, we have Hannah Regis Agulto.
Next up, we have Miko Josh De La Rosa Umali.
Next up, we have Erica Joy C. Bagas.
Next up, we have Daryl Soriano.
Right, coming up next, we have Victoria C. Dela Cruz.
Next up, we have Annie Wren.
Next up, we have Cabrina C. Esner.
Next up, we have Sebastian Manabat.
Next up, we have Geraldine Castillo.
Next up, we have John Factor.
All right, next up, we have Song Julie.
All right, next up, we have Micaela and Lucina.
Next up, we have Tiana Juanette Camacho Aldon.
Next up, we have Cristel Liza Alita Itaas.
All right. Coming up next, we have Jin Suk James Park.
All right, next up we have Juliana Chloe D. Batigas.
All right. Next up, we have Joanna Mishka P. Carrion.
Next up we have Macy Carmel A. Manzanares.
Next up, we have Maria Love Jane Loxin Lumawag.
All right, next up we have Nolana Victoria C. Pangilinan.
Next up, we have Ken Jr. Aldon.
Next up we have Subin Novelin Cho.
All right. Next up, we have Jenny and Vistan Cabayas.
Next up we have Jericho Sacramento.
Okay, next up, we have Reina A. De Leon Guerrero.
Next up, we have Helena Manabat.
Next up, we have Jason Quimsum.
All right, next up we have Danielle Angela Esbanes.
Next up, we have Eliza Megiron Serrano.
Next up we have Istiak Nahid.
Next up, we have Jamie O'Don.
All right, next up we have Nathaniel Alejo.
Next up, we have Sarah May Kalege.
Carly, is it Hill, right? Hill, okay. All right, next up we have Carly Gil C. Deco.
Next up, we have Erin On.
Next up, we have Sildre, Job, and Veloria.
Next up, we have Reynolyn Joanne Capileo Blas.
Next up, we have Zoe Mareham.
Next up, we have Fiona S. Mengloy.
All right, next up, we have Lillian Takagami Pozieski.
Next up, we have Ralph Adrian Alvarez Villas.
All right, next up, we have Jerissa Kosam.
All right, coming up next, we have Irene Shira Aranda Valley.
Next up, we have David Myers Jr.
All right, next up, we have Daniel Marcel B. Barcilla.
Next up, we have Adalbert Camacho. Next up, we have Lemisian Kerasian.
Next up, we have Lady Shay Russia.
Next up, we have Rico Ojima.
Next up, we have Hero Javier.
Next up, we have Fael C. Pagaduan.
we have Raisha Mongwath.
Next up, we have Mayumi Strengel-Mercor.
Next up, we have Aaron Alexander El Sabar.
Next up, we have Mary Frances Tenorio.
Next up, we have Joanne Grace Miranda Repaburbio.
All right, next up, we have Holly Sarah Leban.
Next up, we have Trenton Jew Tenorio De Leon Guerrero.
All right, next up, we have Skylar B. Monaco. Katrina, congratulations.
Next up, we have Rulin Han.
Yes! Woohoo! Next up, we have Katrina Costales.
Next up, we have Coloma B. Costa.
Next up, we have Romay Andrea Adaza Awit.
Next up, we have Miles Gregory Navarro.
Next up, we have Cedric Camacho.
Next up, we have Denzel Floyd Alejandro Salas.
All right, next up we have Antoinette Hernandez.
Next up, we have Patricia Dyer Pack.
Next up, we have Suan Marie G. Huevos.
Next up, we have Janelyn Mariel L. Cruz.
Next up, we have Owen Rye. Congratulations, Owen.
Next up, we have Jessica Diana Zhao Liu.
All right, next up we have Christian G. Ares.
Hey, congratulations. Next up, we have Liam E. Ariola.
All right, next up we have Nathanette Marie Camacho Plus. And last but not definitely the least, we have Jace Bryant M. Song Song!
And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes Marianas High School's class of 2021 drive-through graduation.
When all our shadows disappeared, the animals inside came out to play. Went face to face with all our fears, learned our lessons through the tears, made memories we knew would never fade. One day my father, he told me, son, don't let it slip away. He took me in his arms, I heard him say, when you get older, your wild heart will live for younger days. Think of me if ever you're afraid. He said one day you'll leave this world behind, so live a life you will remember. My father told me when I was just a child, these are the nights that never die. My father told me. These are the nights that never die. My father told me.